Galveston, September 1900. Galveston looked untouchable. Electric streetcars rolled past avenues lined with Victorian mansions. Telephones rang inside the offices of cotton exporters. The harbor moved more money per square foot than almost any other port in the United States. By population, the city held more millionaires than Manhattan. 38,000 people lived there, packed onto a narrow strip of sand between the Gulf of Mexico and Galveston Bay, certain they had built the Texan version of the future. And that island carried one detail everyone knew, yet almost no one took seriously. The highest point in the entire city sat less than 3 meters above sea level. On the night of September 8th, the richest city in Texas would come close to being wiped off the map. Somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people would die within a few hours. And the most unsettling part of this story isn't even what was about to happen. It's that almost all of it had already been predicted days earlier, by people who knew exactly what was coming. Years before, there had been a proposal to build a massive stone seawall along the beach. It was debated, studied, and shelved. The man who helped convince the city that wall wasn't necessary had a name, a title, and a reputation. Isaac Monroe Klein, chief meteorologist at the Weather Bureau station in Galveston. In 1891, he published an article stating it would be nearly impossible for a cyclone to cause serious damage on that stretch of coast. That line came to be treated almost like a guarantee of safety. If the leading experts said everything was fine, why spend money on a wall? Worth pausing here. This isn't really about meteorology. It's about how easily an entire city can feel protected simply because someone credible said, with conviction, that the danger wasn't real. An expert's confidence, on its own, has never once changed the behavior of the ocean. While Galveston carried on with its streetcars, its cotton, and its evening opera, more than 1,000 kilometers away in Cuba, Jesuit scientists at the Belm College Observatory were already tracking a dangerous system forming in the Caribbean. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular history of this disaster. At the time, they ran one of the most accurate cyclone forecasting networks in the world, built over decades of watching cloud patterns, atmospheric pressure, and the behavior of the sea. But 2 years earlier, in 1898, the United States had taken administrative control of Cuba after the Spanish-American War, and the Weather Bureau in Washington cut off the Cuban station's access to the international telegraph lines. The rivalry between the two institutions was real, and it would prove costly. A powerful storm tore through the Caribbean, struck Cuba with winds above 160 kilometers per hour, and left a death toll that should have been warning enough for any careful observer. Even so, Washington held to a different forecast. The cyclone, they insisted, would curve out into the Atlantic, away from the Gulf of Mexico. That was the forecast that stuck, not because it had better evidence behind it, but because it came from the institution considered the ultimate authority on the subject. By Friday, September 7th, the sea had already started behaving in a way Isaac Klein didn't recognize from any textbook. The waves were rolling in higher, spaced further apart, arriving from an angle that matched nothing typical for the region. He walked down to the beach and found curious bathers, families who had come out specifically to watch this unusual spectacle of nature. Nobody saw danger in it. They saw only an unexpected attraction on a hot September afternoon. That afternoon, he went along the coastline personally warning residents in the low-lying areas to move inland, into brick buildings that stood higher ground. Most didn't budge. They'd seen strong surf before. Galveston knew storms. What nobody there could recognize was the difference between an ordinary strong storm and whatever was building out in the Gulf. On Saturday morning, September 8th, the barometer at the weather station began dropping in a way Klein had never witnessed. It wasn't a gradual decline. It was a free fall. Over the course of the day, pressure would bottom out at 936 millibars, a number any modern meteorologist would instantly recognize as the signature of an extremely violent hurricane. Decades later, researchers who cross-referenced those readings with the scale of destruction classified the Galveston storm as equivalent to a Category 4 hurricane, with gusts estimated between 210 and 235 kilometers per hour. But that scale didn't exist yet. There was only one man staring at an instrument, watching a number that made no sense against everything he himself had argued 9 years earlier. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Klein wired Washington 2 words he had never used in his entire career: serious danger. According to the Weather Bureau's own records, it was one of the first times a southern station had abandoned the cautious language the institution required. Guidance that specifically discouraged the word hurricane in public warnings to avoid causing panic. The telegram reached Washington. It never made it back to the streets of Galveston in time. By 3 o'clock, the city was still running on its normal rhythm. Shops open, offices working, kids walking home from school. An hour and a half later, the bridges connecting the island to the mainland were already destroyed or underwater. Galveston had just been cut off from the rest of the world, with no idea that this was still the smallest of its problems for that night. Here's the detail most documentaries about this disaster skip over, and it's exactly what made this tragedy different from any other hurricane in American history. Galveston was a narrow island, water on both sides. When the storm hit, the sea surged in from the front and the back of the city at the same time. There was nowhere for the water to drain. It was like putting the island inside a bathtub and turning on 2 faucets at once. Within a few hours, the storm surge topped 4.5 meters on an island whose highest ground stood under 3. Starting around 6 that evening, the deadliest part of the mechanism kicked in. It wasn't just wind tearing off roofs. It was what the wind and the water did together with the wreckage of the first houses destroyed along the shoreline. Planks, beams, slate roof tiles, entire door frames got swept up by the current and hurled into the next row of houses. Every building that collapsed fed the wave of debris that took down the one after it. Within hours, a wall of wood and metal stretching for kilometers was moving across the island from south to north like an enormous scythe. That night, most of the deaths in Galveston weren't drownings. They were impact deaths. A wooden beam launched at over 200 kilometers an hour carried enough force to punch through walls and crush anyone in its path. Doctors who examined the bodies in the days that followed reported skull fractures and injuries so severe they had no precedent in any civil disaster recorded in the United States up to that point. Isaac Klein was inside his own house on Key Avenue with his wife Cora, 8 months pregnant, their 3 daughters, and around 50 people who had come there looking for shelter. Isaac himself had welcomed them in. He believed it was one of the sturdiest buildings in the city, solid enough to withstand the storm. But around 8:30 that night, a stretch of railroad track, dragged in by the current, slammed straight into the house. The structure split in half. Of the roughly 50 people sheltering there, only 18 survived, clinging to pieces of roof still floating in the dark water. Isaac managed to save his 3 daughters. Cora went under. Her body wasn't recovered until a month later, found among the wreckage of the very house he had believed could survive a cyclone. About 400 meters away, at St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, 10 nuns were caring for 93 children. When water flooded the ground floor, they moved the children upstairs. When the second floor started flooding too, they climbed to the attic. And when they realized the building wasn't going to hold, they did something that's still hard to describe without a lump in the throat. They tied the children to themselves with clothesline rope, forming human chains. It wasn't a gesture of despair. It was the only way to make sure that, if those bodies were ever found, they would at least be found together. Each one identifiable, each one with a name. The building came down not long after. Of the 93 children, only 3 survived. When rescuers arrived the next morning, they found bodies still bound to one another, exactly as the nuns had planned. Not everything fell that night, though. A few blocks away, a brick and iron mansion designed by architect Nicholas Clayton for attorney Walter Gresham, known today as Bishop's Palace, sheltered dozens of families who ran there searching for the sturdiest building in the neighborhood. The house stayed standing. Everyone inside survived. 2 blocks further on, in buildings that looked just as solid, almost no one made it out. There was no visible logic to who lived and who died. Just the distance between one wall and another, one foundation and another, being in one place instead of 100 meters down the road. That might be the hardest part of a tragedy at this scale to accept. Survival, more often than not, has nothing to do with merit, courage, or faith. It comes down to luck, to geography, to the completely random decision to knock on the right door on a night when there were no right doors left. Around midnight, the wind began losing strength. Near 2 in the morning, the water finally started to recede. When the sun rose on Sunday, September 9th, Galveston no longer existed as a city. 1/3 of its buildings were simply gone, not damaged, erased from the map entirely. Where whole streets of mansions, homes, and shops had stood, there were now just empty foundations and piles of splintered wood that no one could recognize anymore as a dining room, a child's bedroom, or a fabric shop. Death toll estimates range between 6,000 and 8,000. Some sources put the number as high as 12,000, though an exact figure will never be possible. Entire families vanished with no one left alive to even register their deaths. To this day, this remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. But what came after was almost as brutal as the storm itself. No drinking water, no electricity, no hospitals equipped to handle a disaster of this size. The September heat sped up decomposition, and fear of outbreaks, cholera, typhoid, grew by the day. The first plan was to load the dead onto barges and bury them at sea. Within days, the current started washing the bodies back onto the beaches. There weren't enough coffins for thousands of people. There wasn't time or cemetery space either, so the city made one of the most agonizing decisions of the entire tragedy. It built massive funeral pyres across the island and burned its own dead for weeks, in full view of the people who had survived. Help arrived from all over the country. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, nearly 80 years old at the time, came to Galveston to personally run relief operations in what became one of the largest humanitarian efforts in U.S. history up to that point. Then came the question that would decide the city's future: abandon the island, or find a way to make sure a disaster like this could never happen again? Galveston chose to stay. What happened next remains one of the most remarkable engineering projects in American history. Between 1902 and 1910, the city built a massive protective seawall along its coastline and physically raised the ground level of the entire city. More than 2,000 buildings, including churches weighing thousands of tons, were lifted inch by inch using enormous mechanical jacks, while millions of cubic meters of sand were pumped underneath to create an entirely new layer of ground. In many cases, families kept living in their own homes throughout construction, climbing temporary staircases as the floors slowly rose beneath their feet. There's another consequence of the tragedy that almost never shows up in Galveston documentaries, and it might be the most surprising of all. The collapse of the city's government during the disaster exposed the limits of the old political model so clearly that Galveston soon adopted a new form of government entirely. Instead of the traditional setup, the city came to be run by a commission of specialists, each responsible for a different area of the city. That model, which became known as the Galveston Plan, was later adopted by hundreds of American municipalities and left a lasting mark on local government across much of the country. A city destroyed by a communication failure ended up, without meaning to, changing how other cities were governed. Proof that the rebuild worked came 15 years later. In August of 1915, another hurricane hit Galveston. The storm surge reached levels similar to 1900, in some spots slightly higher. Inside the area protected by the new seawall, 11 people died. In the areas still left unprotected, around 264 died. That gap wasn't chance. It was the result of a city that had finally decided to act.